All right. My name is Tim Griffin. I'm the Division Chair of Agriculture, Food, and Environment here at the Friedman School and also the Dean of Educational Affairs here at Friedman. With that, it is 12 noon right now, so I want to get right to our speaker. It's certainly my pleasure to introduce Bruce Friedrich, who is the president and founder of the Good Food Institute, who's going to talk about Protein Reimagined, transforming the global food system. So Bruce, I'm going to hand it over to you.
So yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Timothy. Thank you very much to all of the organizers of this conference. I thoroughly enjoyed the previous session. That conversation I thought was fantastic. And I think this is a nice build from that conversation. So I hope a lot of people heard that, although this also does work as a standalone. So Protein Reimagined, Transforming the Global Food System. The title of the talk, I think, begs the question, why do we need to transform the global food system? So my level set on that question is this observation, that globally, since 1961, the amount of meat, and this also includes eggs, the amount of animal agriculture globally has been going up and up and up to here, and it's expected, this is a UNFAO slide or UNFAO statistics. They're predicting about 60% more animal agriculture through 2050. There have actually been 11 peer review articles looking at what animal agriculture will look like through 2050. This is the lowest of the predictions. The highest of the predictions is more than 3 times as much. They mostly hover at about double the amount of animal agriculture that we have right now globally by 2050. And that's on the basis of developing, on the basis of both population growth as well as a growing per capita consumption. And per capita consumption is growing both in developed economies at a fairly slow level and in developing economies at a very fast level. And the problem with that is that even on our current trajectory, even with the current amount of animal agriculture that exists, according to scientists, the Paris Climate Agreement goal to keep climate change within 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels, there is now a scientific consensus, and this was well covered in the previous session, but there's a scientific consensus that the amount of meat, dairy, and eggs consumed has to go down. And yet there are no scientists predicting that that is going to happen. If we are going to get 60% to more than double the amount of meat through 2050, we will blow past the 1.5 degree goal. And the 2.0 goal will probably be impossible. So what's the solution? A lot of people think the solution is to convince global populations to consume fewer animal products. Our hypothesis at GFI is that that is not likely. These are articles about peer review papers from 2016, 17, and 18. The profound planetary consequences of eating less meat. 16,000 scientists signed dire warning to humanity over the health of the planet. That scientific call to action said that the world needs to eat 90% less meat to keep us within planetary boundaries. Huge reduction in meat eating, essential to avoid climate breakdown. Then in 2019, the Eat Lancet report basically also said that globally we need to slash our meat production and consumption. And yet this is what is actually happening. And this is what 100% of scientists who study global meat production and consumption think is going to happen. There is literally nobody in the scientific field who thinks we're going to get to a reality different from this. And that's despite this kind of education. So even in the United States, it's pretty shocking to realize, and I think it'll be surprising to realize for a bunch of people who have come to, a bunch of people from Boston who have come to a session talking about global food system reform, but the 5 highest years for per capita meat consumption in the United States are the most recent 5. So we do think there is significant value to educating people about the harms of industrial animal agriculture and encouraging people to consume less meat. But at the end of the day, that's the strategy of the last more than 50 years. And for 50 years, what has happened is that even per capita meat consumption just keeps going up and up and up. So the hypothesis and the focus of the Good Food Institute is that we need to think differently. We need to meet consumers where they are. And meeting them where they are means we need to give them alternatives to the meat that has all of these external costs, but that they find delicious and affordable. So GFI is about 185 full-time people. I'll do a quick intro to GFI in a little bit. The main thing to say is that all of us are focused essentially on what does it look like to biomimic the precise meat experience with plants, or what does it look like to make actual animal meat using tissue engineering, to cultivate meat from a small sample of animal cells. And the idea here, the plant-based meat, this is not tofu, this is not tempeh, this is not your grandparents' veggie burgers. The idea is that meat, actual animal meat, is made up of lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. Plants also have lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. We can hire tissue engineers and meat scientists and plant biologists and mechanical engineers, and we can figure out how to create the exact same meat experience using plants, or for people who absolutely want to continue to eat actual animal meat, we can cultivate that meat directly from cells, and it's actual animal meat, but with a fraction of the adverse impact. We believe this is, in food and agriculture, the one solution to the harms of industrial animal agriculture that analogizes nicely to renewable energy as a solution, correction to the harms of fossil fuels, or electric vehicles as a solution to the harms of gas-powered combustion engines. So with renewable energy, there is a recognition that globally energy consumption is going to go up. Nobody thinks that's not going to happen. And it would be, we agree with the critique that it would smack of neocolonialism for governments in the first world to tell people in developing economies that they don't get to develop because climate change. The solution is not convince the world to consume less energy. The solution is to shift energy production from fossil fuels to renewables. Exact same thing with electric vehicles. There is an understanding that inexorably, as we have more people on the planet, and those people become better off, they are going to consume more energy, they are going to drive more miles, and they are going to consume more animal meat, dairy, and eggs. But in the same way that we can slash the adverse climate impact of energy production and driving, we can do the same thing with meat by switching to plant-based and cultivated meat. So here's an example. Two plant-based meat products, two companies that are focused on what we think is most important, and that's eliminating what Bill Gates calls the green premium. So we need to win in the marketplace. At the end of the day, the vast majority of people are simply not going to pay more to lessen the climate impact of their food. So we need to win on price. And the vast majority of people are not going to sacrifice on taste. So we need to win on taste. That's what these two companies are doing. And the Impossible Burger and the Beyond Burger, relative to beef burgers, cause 10% of the direct emissions. So they cut 9/10 of the direct emissions, and they use about a 20th of the land. And for those of you who are very up on your climate change and food metrics, what you know is that this land use change is probably at least as big a deal as the direct emissions change. You add this up, and it is a colossal benefit for the climate as well as for biodiversity from this change. If you're talking about cultivated meat, so this is actual animal meat, but using tissue engineering, the direct emissions slashing, it's even more a deeper cut in direct emissions from a switch to cultivation to create your actual animal meat using tissue engineering rather than live animals. It's again about 1/20 of the land. For pork, you're talking about half the emissions. So that's about the same as switching over the life of a vehicle. It's about the same as switching from a combustion engine gas-powered car to an electric vehicle. Halves your direct emissions, but also has this additional benefit of requiring less than 1/3 of the amount of land. Even chicken requires something like 1/3 of the amount of land and cuts global warming climate emissions by 17%. Also a very big benefit. The other thing to say about the benefits of alternative proteins is that they are significant across some other critically important global health and global human well-being metrics. So one of those is food security. Probably everybody in this room is aware of the fact that the war between Ukraine and Russia has displaced about 50 million metric tons of corn and wheat. We now feed more than 25 times that amount of crops to farm animals. So in 2009, we were feeding about 750 million metric tons of corn and wheat to farm animals. By 2020, that was north of 1 billion metric tons. So 20 times the amount displaced by the war between Ukraine and Russia, as well as 270 million metric tons of soy, because about 78% of the global soy crop is fed to chickens, pigs, and farmed fish predominantly. So this is the fall issue of Foreign Policy magazine, and I co-authored an article with the CEO and founder of Climate Advisors about both food security and climate change and the positive impacts of a shift in the direction of alternative proteins. And this was basically calling on global governments to make this shift. So we go into multiple pages about the two relationships that I was just talking about with regard to climate change and food security. But in terms of driving up the price of cereals, the demand for land, the demand for grains is exacerbating global malnutrition and global poverty. And we can slash the land use needs and the crop inputs by shifting to plant-based and cultivated meat. Two other global health benefits of this shift. One of them is antimicrobial resistance. So globally, more than 70% of all medically relevant antibiotics are fed to farm animals. This is a piece that was on the front page of the New York Times magazine about medically relevant antibiotic use by the pork industry in China. But even in the United States, the amount of medically relevant antibiotics that are being fed to farm animals is extraordinarily high, and it's going up. It's north of 70% of all of the antibiotics used in the United States are not used to treat human illness. They're used prophylactically on farm animals. So if we're going to double, and again, we're expected to double the amount of animal agriculture through to 2050, that's going to make climate goals impossible. That's going to make biodiversity preservation extraordinarily difficult. That's going to make food secure. That's going to have huge adverse food security implications, and that is going to double the amount of medically relevant antibiotics that we are going to need for farm animal production. And an article in the journal The Lancet 2 years ago said that 1.3 million people globally are already dying from superbugs, from antibiotic-resistant bacteria. They're predicting that will be 10 million by the year 2050. The UK government has said the threat to the human race from antimicrobial resistance is more certain than the threat from climate change. We're literally talking about an end to modern medicine from antibiotic overuse in both humans and animals, but animals are a big part of the problem. And then the last thing I want to mention is pandemic risk. This is a report, Preventing the Next Pandemic, from the UN Environment Program and the International Livestock Research Institute. They pulled together 13 of the world's leading zoonotic disease specialists, as well as something like 50 reviewers for this report. In the report, this is their list of the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. The first one is that doubling of demand for animal protein globally. Every farm animal is a potential vector for the next pandemic. If we go from the tens of billions of farm animals we have now to double that, they listed that first as their 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. They listed second industrial animal agriculture, and they cited 2 things. One was the fact that these are largely genetic clone animals, so that depresses the animal's immune systems. And then the second thing that they cited is that the conditions that the animals are kept in are unhygienic. So it's a doubly, it's a doubling of sort of the inputs into something that could breed the next pandemic. Of these 7, all of them are linked to industrial animal agriculture, other than increased use and exploitation of wildlife. So 6 of the 7, the only one that isn't related to increased industrial animal agriculture is the one that has to do with eating wild animals like bats. So if that was the cause of COVID-19, it fits into this bucket, and it's the one thing that's not exacerbated by industrial animal agriculture. So this is the most important slide. So I think it's in here 3 times. This is the most important thing that I want people to take away from this presentation. And that is that we are on a trajectory. All of the harms of industrial animal agriculture that Rob was talking about on the last session, all of them that I've laid out in this session, are slated to double by 2050, unless we come up with an effective strategy to address it. And my hypothesis, and I would encourage people to challenge me on this in the chat in the question and answer, my hypothesis is that while alternative proteins do not address all of the harms of our current food system, they are not a silver bullet for like everything that ails us. They are far and away the most likely way that we address the need for twice as much animal agriculture by 2050. They are the one solution that anybody in this conversation has seen that work with capitalism and that consequently analogize to renewable energy and electric vehicles. So as I'll show you in just a minute, GFI, actually I'll show you now, this is the areas of the world where GFI operates. So we have, GFI is actually 6 independent NGOs, although we coordinate very quickly. We share objectives, and then we coordinate and cooperate on key results. The KPI system that we use is the objectives and key results system that Google popularized. So we've got GFI in the US, and then we also have Brazil, Europe, Israel, India, and Asia Pacific out of Singapore. And GFI, if you want to sort of think about how to think about us, we are to alternative proteins as a solution to climate change, what Environmental Defense and the World Wildlife Fund are to renewable energy and electric vehicles as a solution to climate change. GFI is not a vegetarian organization or a reducitarian organization. We're not a diet change organization at all. Our focus, so again, to the renewable energy and electric vehicles, we're not the people trying to convince you to buy a Tesla or put solar panels on your house. We're the people behind the scenes trying to create policies around the switch and trying to create a scientific startup and industry ecosystem that facilitates a global shift. So we're not in Israel because we care what people in Israel eat. We're not in Singapore because we care what people in Singapore eat. The reason we are in these 6 areas of the world, our entire rubric is 2 questions. And the question 1 is, are there world-class scientists in this country to do work to help figure out how to biomimic meat with plants or cultivate meat directly from cells? And 2, does the government support cutting-edge R&D and cutting-edge entrepreneurship? That's why we're in the 6 areas of the world that we're in, because these 6 countries, or in the case of Europe, regions, are really focused on answering yes to both of those questions. So a quick intro to GFI. As I mentioned, across all 6 GFIs, we coordinate on our objectives. Our programmatic objectives have to do with science, policy, and industry. Our science and technology focus, the plurality of GFI's team members around the world are scientists. The goal of all of our work is to get to a world where the products, alternative proteins, can compete with industrial animal products, principally on price and taste. Until GFI, no one, NGO or otherwise, had done a technological readiness assessment of plant-based meat or cultivated meat. So nobody had asked the question, what do we know to solve these fundamental scientific challenges? What do we know we don't know? And where are the areas of exploration that we need to dive in more deeply? So TRAs were the first. When we started hiring staff in 2016, 2 of our first 6 staff after me were scientists, and the first thing they did was started figuring out the technological readiness of these 2 technologies. And now we have monthly Science of All Protein webinars. We have a steady stream of information about the science of making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells. GFI's, we have a MOOC, we have a massive open online course that anybody is welcome to take, and lots of other things in the science and technology field. So monthly webinars, frequent workshops, a collaborative research directory, GF Ideas community, research, but you can read all of this. And I'm also happy to share this deck with anybody who would like to see the deck. Tufts is really ground zero in the US on especially the cultivated meat side. So David Kaplan at Tufts was part of the application to USDA that landed $10 million from USDA to start a Center for Excellence in Cellular Agriculture. And he, at a workshop in Tufts about six weeks ago, credited GFI's scientific ecosystem building as the dispositive cause of his being able to branch out and make the alliances that led to that $10 million grant from USDA. One of the things I'm most enthusiastic about that we do is our Alt Protein project. That's our university chapter project. So you can see the 36 university chapters that we have at the moment. It is a rigorous process to become a GFI university chapter. So just like we have OKRs, objectives and key results, we require that from all of our chapters. We require that people go through a training. We require that they file quarterly OKR update reports. For anybody who wants to find out more about it, if you just Google Alternative Protein Project, you can find out more. And the application process for next year is open right now. Our second key result, our second objective has to do with policy. And this is our global battle cry. Our global battle cry is that governments should be funding alternative proteins in the same way and for the same reason that governments fund renewable energy, governments fund the shift to electric vehicles, governments fund drug development. There are massive climate, biodiversity, and global health advantages to shifting in this direction. So the number one thing we're doing globally is advocating for public investment into open access research and private sector incentives. We also do a lot of ecosystem building with other non-governmental organizations. We do a lot on cultivated meat regulation as well as fair public policy. But this is the number one thing that we're focused on, is generating billions of dollars in government. Our goal is $9.8 billion globally into alternative proteins, $4.7 billion for open access R&D, and 4.1 and $5.7 billion for private sector incentives. This is exactly what has worked for renewable energy and electric vehicles, and we're trying to basically draw from that playbook. In just the last couple of years, we've seen a fair amount of positive movement from a lot of governments. So up until about 2.5 years ago, the amount of government support was zero. Over the last couple of years, it has gone up to hundreds of millions of dollars, and we expect to see more and more government movement in this direction. The Global Innovation Needs Assessment from the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and ClimateWorks Foundation, that's where we got our $10.1 billion number. So the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and ClimateWorks Foundation, they say that by 2050, alternative proteins will be a gross value add to the global economy of $1.1 trillion, that the climate benefits will be $5.5 trillion, that they will add 9.8 million jobs, and that they will free up resources that will allow food prices to go down and consequently more people to eat. So this is bipartisan. Everybody in government, or very close to everybody in government, wants to make sure that entrepreneurial communities are supported, that small businesses are supported, that science is prioritized. So the director of the National Science Foundation was a Trump appointee who passed the Senate with 100-0 support. Science is bipartisan, entrepreneurship is bipartisan. Those 9.8 million jobs are bipartisan. And Donald Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, Donald Trump's FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, both legitimate champions of alternative proteins because they saw the jobs in the heartland as something that they wanted to keep in America. And that is also the sort of global competition on science is also bipartisan. So those are some of the things that we lean into. And obviously we lean into those in the US, we lean into those everywhere. The third leg of our stool is industry engagement. GFI works across the scope of industry. So we are very excited, proud, happy to have partners in the largest meat company in the world, JBS, which consistently puts us into its press releases about its cultivated meat endeavors, as well as its plant-based meat endeavors. We also work very closely. We work very closely with all of the biggest meat and food companies in the world. And our pitch to them is essentially like their goal is not to be involved in selling meat for the sake of selling meat. They want to supply high quality protein affordably and profitably to as many people as possible. So our pitch to them is that this can do that in a way that also has massive advantages for climate, global health, biodiversity, et cetera. So kind of the pitch is don't be Kodak, be Canon, and lean into innovation. And that's meeting with success. Whether you're talking about the three biggest meat companies in the world are JBS, Tyson, and Cargill. The two biggest food companies in the world are Nestle and ADM. All of them are prioritizing both plant-based meat and cultivated meat. And we see that as advantageous for a whole host of reasons, but really delighted that that is the direction things are going. GFI also works from pre-startup, helping entrepreneurs figure out what the white spaces are, where it would make sense for them to start companies. We have investor resources, et cetera. So here's the slide that underlines this concept. So I said we have a monthly science of alt protein webinar. We also have a monthly business of alt protein webinar. We also produce a lot of think tank reports and do frequent workshops. We have an investor directory, a GF Ideas community, a company database. These are our annual state of the industry reports. The 2022 reports will be coming out any second. Already mentioned, this is where we operate. I think we're a little north of 185 staff at the moment. So in the interest of time, I'll just say we do all of what I just described, policy, industry, and science across all of the 6 GFIs. So this is one of our policy team members with the head of the environment in Singapore. This is 2 of our Brazil team members with officials in the Brazilian government. Speaking at an EU convention, members of the Indian government, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's probably the foremost global supporter of alternative proteins. Really honored to have been selected by Giving Green, which is an effective altruism charity evaluators, as one of the 5 most impactful charities globally. If what you're interested in is making the biggest positive difference with your charitable dollars on climate. And this is from the Eat Lancet report. One of the co-authors, humanity now poses a threat to the stability of the planet. This requires nothing less than a new global agricultural revolution. We have been growing crops to feed them to animals so that we can eat animals for 12,000 years. In the same way that we can do better on fossil fuels, we can do better on combustion engines, we can also do better on how we satisfy what appears to be an absolutely innate human desire for meat. And I am super excited to dive into having a conversation with folks. Anybody who wants to learn more about GFI, we have 4 different newsletters. We have an investor newsletter, a policy newsletter, a general keeping up with the industry newsletter. If you Google Alternative Protein Project, that's probably the quickest and easiest way to get to the Alt Protein Project, but this is the direct URL. And we are 100% powered by philanthropy. So if you know anyone who is looking for really high impact ways to make a difference through philanthropy, feel free to put them in touch with us, or you can send them to gfi.org/donate. And with that, I will stop my screen share and look forward to an engaging and fun conversation. Thanks, everybody.